Welcome to this presentation from financialfairplay.co.uk. We're going to be looking at the way that players' contracts are written down or amortised. So I'll start off with an example here, really. We've got a player who was signed on a purchase price of £50 million on a 5-year contract. The amortisation rate basically is 50 divided by 5, which gives us a rate of £10 million a year. So what that means is that that player has to be written off in the accounts at the rate of £10 million a year for every year of that contract. I should point out, of course, that players aren't really bought and sold like commodities. What actually happens is that the club is purchasing the right to acquire the contract of the player. That's what you often see within the financial fair play terminology. So to take this example a step further, then. This is really what happens to the player in terms of the books and the balance sheet of the club. Same example, purchase price £50 million. He has over a 5-year contract written off at £10 million a year. At the end of year 1, he's got a book value of £40 million. So what that means is that the player's written off like an asset, so that at the end of year 1, he's sitting there in the accounts as being worth £40 million, and at the end of year 2 it's £30 million, right down to the end of year 5 when he has a value in the accounts of 0, and that's because, of course, at the end of the contract the player is just able to walk away from the club. I should mention as well that this whole piece about the way that players' contracts purchase prices are written down doesn't apply to wages. So what happens with wages is that the wages must be accounted for in the year that they're incurred. There's none of this kind of writing down of players' wages and amortising their wages in this way. It's an expense in whatever year it's occurred. So, taking it a bit further, then we've got an example of a player who's sold before the end of the contract. So, using the same example there, purchase price £50 million, written off at the rate of £10 million a year. At the end of year 3, then he's got a £20 million book value. Then the club decide to sell him. In this scenario, they sell him for £35 million. So that's actually, less than they bought him for. But he's sitting there in their accounts with a £20 million book value. So actually, the difference between £35 million, what they sold him for, and the book value is £15 million. The club has actually made a profit in terms of, an accounting profit for this year. So the club will basically get a £15 million credit in their accounts for that year immediately when it happens, because the contract is effectively ended with the club. Conversely, if they were to sell the player for less than the book value, this example £10 million, well, they've actually made a loss, and this loss, here, the £10 million in this example, has to be written off immediately in the year that it happens. Interestingly, there was this case with Carlos Tevez recently. People were saying when he wouldn't come off the bench, why don't City just, be done with him, tear up his contract and send him on his way? Well, if they'd have done that, then City would have missed out on the selling price of the player, because, if there's no contract, you can't get a price for the player. So they'd missed out on that. But also, as well, Tevez would have been sitting in City's books with a book value, a positive book value of about £27 million at the time. So if they'd have torn up the contract, City would have to written off as an expense that £27 million book value immediately in the year that it happened, which would have been a massive blow for City, which is one of the reasons why they didn't do that. I suppose one more thing I want to mention about the whole way that players' purchase prices are amortised is that, of course, this only applies to players who are purchased. So if you've got a youth team player who's come through the books, it hasn't cost you anything to acquire his contract in the first place, then there's nothing to write down in this way. The only expense for that player will be the wages. So finally, then, the final example is what happens when we extend a contract. So here's same example, £50 million for a player, written off at £10 million a year. At the end of year 3, he's got £20 million sitting with his book value there. Now, in this example, the player's offered a 4-year contract, a new contract extension is given a new 4-year deal. What you have to do then is basically divide the book value by the number of years of the new contract. In this case, it's a 4-year deal. They'd have to write him off at £5 million a year. So at the end of year 1 of this new contract, he'd have a book value of £15 million, and that would continue to write down at £5 million a year until the end of year 4. He has a 0 book value. Final thing I should add really is that if a player is sold part way through the year, the club has to kind of account for that in kind of parts. They won't write off. They'll write off half of the due amortised rate for that year. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you want to know any more information, please go to financialfairplay.co.uk. There's loads of diagrams and videos and the latest news on this hot topic in football. So thank you for watching.